Now, there's an old saying that dead men don't tell tales, but our next guests have proven that wrong. Helen Goltz and Chris Adams visit cemeteries and monuments to gather research for their series of books, Grave Tales. And their latest is on Sydney, where some final resting places really have a story to tell. And Helen and Chris are here to tell us all about it. Welcome to Studio 10.
Thanks, sir.
Does it feel a bit spooky going to cemeteries and doing this kind of research?
Well, we never do it at night. That's fine. Yeah. But we've always had a bit of a love for cemeteries. It's not something you sort of share on a first couple of dates. It doesn't come out till later. But you know, it's the history, it's the peace and quiet, and it's amazing how many people come out of the woodwork, so to speak, and say, "I love it. I love them too." Mm.
Yeah. And so this is where you do you go there for fun? Like, is it?
Well, is it the big Waverley? Is it the Waverley Cemetery
Yeah.
on the rocks, which is such a spectacular place where people have been laid to rest, and it's almost like a story has been inscribed on some of the headstones there.
That's pretty rare, by the way. I mean, that's why we tend to start with the story and then find the graves that match it later, if you know what I mean.
So you start with a story first, then go to the cemetery, try and find a grave.
Find the people whose story can tell the story of whatever the event was.
So didn't you go to the grave of someone who shot a member of the royal family here?
Yeah.
Who was that?
There was a fellow called Henry O Farrell. He was a mad Irishman and was probably suffering from some mental problems. When Prince Alfred came here in the 1860s, the first British visitor ever to come to our country, he shot him.
Wow! Was that in Clontarf?
It was in Clontarf,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah, Clontarf Beach in Sydney.
Yeah. And so he was, of course, carted off and tried. And
So the prince survived?
The prince survived, yes. Bullet hit his ribs and didn't do a great deal of damage. And Henry was carted off, tried and, of course, hanged. A lot of people would think with rather indecent haste.
Yeah, right.
But...
Also, Sydney was hit by the Black Plague in 1900, and you've looked at the story of one of those victims.
Yeah, we in this story, we've looked at the second victim, the second person to die from it, because the first guy who died, can't find the grave of him. But it caused such a scare here. The number of course, the plague carried by rats, which came off ships, which came to the country from other places where they had the disease. The fleas then bit people. They got it and subsequently died.
But it was a bit fortuitous too, wasn't it?
Well, there is an upside to it, I suppose.
Really?
From some perspective, absolutely, because there's so many of the houses in the inner suburbs of Sydney in those days were uninhabitable, technically. I mean, people lived in them, but they got horrible diseases and died, very quickly from it. So a lot of those houses were pulled out. And it cleared the areas which are now the approaches to the Sydney Harbour Bridge.
Oh, wow.
So
Whatever it takes.
exactly.
It's quite amazing to think that a medieval kind of disease like the Black Plague was right here in Sydney at the turn of the century.
Killed millions in Europe in the 14th century.
That's right. We are fascinated, of course, still by Arthur Stace. And the Eternity Man, he had something very interesting written on his final resting place. What's that exactly?
Well, it is that, eternity. Arthur Stace was a fellow who grew up in Redfern. His family were no hope, as you'd call them, I suppose. His parents were both alcoholics. He lived under the house, lived by stealing bread and milk from the neighbours, went off to war, came back, again, was a hopeless drunk. One day walked into St Barnabas Church and heard a fellow talking. As a result of that, he got off the grog. A couple of years later, he heard another man talking about the word eternity and decided then that he would spend his life writing eternity on the footpaths and walls and railway stations of Sydney, which he did.
Wow.
And
there's very few left now, which is one on his gravestone is one of the few.
on the grave.
Now, environmental campaigner Juanita
Nielsen.
Juanita Nielsen. She was presumed murdered, yes.
But still a missing person.
Still a missing person. So does she have a memorial? Is this?
She does. I'm a bit sort of soft-hearted about Juanita because I think what she was doing then is still so vital now. You know, she's trying to save her community from development, keep workers able to access their
Was this in the
roles.
70s?
Yes, 70s. And she went missing, never found. And her family were the Foys, the Mark Foy store, so a very wealthy family, and they've got a very big grave.
In
and
Southeast Cemetery,
She's
yep.
got a little white cross at the front of it, a little memorial.
Even though they've never found her.
Never found her, yeah.
And also, there's a grave that's visited in Sydney by fans of Charles Dickens. How come?
I love the story. Eliza Thorn. She's supposed to have been maybe the catalyst for Miss Havisham.
Oh, OK.
So it's possible. It's a similar thing. She was jilted, wore the wedding dress for the rest of her days.
Wow. How did she end up in Sydney?
She came over with her father, who died before she was betrothed.
Right.
Because he probably wouldn't have allowed her to have continued like that. And when she was left at the altar, she basically didn't change. And it's a theory that perhaps she, relatives wrote home to Charles and he heard about that story. And a little bit of a twist on it, when her gravestone was damaged, the Dickens Society in England helped pay to restore it.
Oh,
Wow. Oh, I love that.
You know, from time to time we hear these stories that our cities are running out of room. We need to dig up our cemeteries and move people elsewhere. There's a bigger focus on cremating people. Do you think something would be lost if we did lose cemeteries? Because they seem like a tribute to the past.
Yeah, well, in a sense you have. You've lost two already here, one where Town Hall now stands and another one where Central Station now stands, were the two original cemeteries.
Yeah, right.
When they both got full, as it were, they decided, the government that was, that they needed one cemetery that could cater for the whole city, and that's where Rookwood started. But of course, since then, there have been others pop up all over the place.
So did they dig people up out of the ground and move them?
Yes.
Oh, wow, I didn't know that.
And on numbers of occasions, right up until 2007, still found every time there was work around Town Hall, they'd find a body or two.
So they'll be finding them under the light rail as we speak.
It could be, yeah. Absolutely. I mean, it's happened in other places. In Brisbane, they did up Lang Park, you know, the footy ground, as recently as 2004, and found 130-odd bodies when they were doing that, because that was where the old Lang Park graveyard used to be.
Yeah, because you look at a graveyard like Waverley Graveyard, which is on prime real estate, it would be worth so much money.
How has it been kept away from developers? It's a miracle.
It is looking over the water. It's absolutely extraordinary. Now, the new book by Helen and Chris is called Grave Tales, Stories Not Laid to Rest, Sydney, Volume 1. It's a rollicking read. Thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure.
Great to have you.
Good to see you.
Now, we are making another call and